Thank you. Folks, in my opening presentation, I put before you four proposals which I argued for. One, that science does not support atheism, but rather it supports theism. It supports a belief in God. Now, Dr. Atkins has not been able to show how, in fact, science disproves the existence of God. And I think that proposal, therefore, stands. Dr. Atkins has argued for explanations for why people believe. And I've already shown in my opening presentation that showing why people came to this understanding is not necessarily a way of disproving it. You can show the reasons to be not good ones, but the thing believed might still be true. Dr. Atkins in his presentation said that science can explain aesthetics, why people perceive beauty, for example. But I think all that science can show is how beauty is perceived by individuals, but not why individuals appreciate beauty in the first place. Dr. Atkins thinks that religious belief can also be explained by science. But all we can do from a scientific inquiry is to explain how people respond to religious beliefs. We can put probes in their brains and see how they respond under different states of religious experience, for example. But to explain the history and origin of religious belief is something that science has not been able to fully elucidate. Neither has historians been able to fully elucidate that history. Some may say that when our ancestors came down from the trees, they felt helpless and they invented this idea of God. However, this is just a hope on the part of evolutionists or atheists. There is no proof or no evidence that when monkeys came down from trees or apes started walking in the savannas, that they felt helpless and hopeless. In fact, the evolutionary theory would point in the other direction, that they had good reason for coming out into the open. Now, Dr. Atkins pointed out that religion and science are similar in that they both search for truth. But he thinks that there is an important difference because science proceeds with public scrutiny, whereas religion proceeds on private, sentimental, wishful thinking. I think the difference, however, was more aptly put by a philosopher, Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler in The Great Ideas explained that there is a difference between science and philosophy. Science is inquisitive, but philosophy is reflective. There are things which cannot be answered by science, for example, as to what do we have to do to be good? Why should we be good in the first place? This has to be explained by philosophy. So that requires reflection. It's a different area than science. You cannot discover by the scientific method why should we be good in the first place. But philosophy tries to answer that. However, philosophy cannot come to final answers, and religion fits that bill, because religion prescribes the final and absolute answers for these such questions. So, to put it in a nutshell, science is inquisitive, philosophy is reflective, but religion is receptive. In fact, Dr. Atkins presented religion as though it is just fit for ignoramuses. However, we realize that we learn information in more than one ways. We might make discoveries of ourselves. We might rely on discoveries of other people. We might, for example, rely on Dr. Atkins to teach us physical chemistry. Now, how do we receive the information from others? We might talk to Dr. Atkins directly, or we may not talk to him directly, but we may read his textbook and learn from that. So we can, in fact, learn information that is not immediately accessible to us by receiving a message through Dr. Atkins' book. Now, all we have to do is to make sure that the book really, in fact, comes from Dr. Atkins. And this is what we have tried to do in the religion of Islam, to scrutinize the Quran. Enemies have tried, believers have tried, to find out whether this book really is from God. And once we are satisfied that there are genuine reasons for believing the Quran to be the Word of God, then we have here a new way of learning opening up to us, in addition to science, and in harmony with science. We need them both.
Question that I can find, the existence after death is not such a belief mathematically irrational. And I'm guessing that's directed to Shabir.
Well, I think perhaps Dr. Atkins might be more adept at dealing with the mathematics on this. However, one of Dr. Atkins's Oxford University colleagues, Professor Keith Ward, in his book God, Chance and Necessity, and in one of his most recent books on the aspect or the prospect of religion in a scientific age, and even in another book on defending the soul, that is the title of the book, he has argued that there is something in human beings which is not yet fully understood by science, and that thing is consciousness. How consciousness came about and what happens to consciousness after death cannot be fully explicated by science, and it is possible that there is a consciousness which survives death. This I do not see how science can actually disprove. But now we said that religion is also receptive, and we have information. If there is a God and if the Quran is his book on both points which we are confident of, then there is a soul that the Quran tells us about that is there with human beings, and we can see that from a scientific point of view as well. There is something in human beings that is much different than animals. For example, the chimpanzee, which is said from the evolutionary point of view to be our closest relative, can think of how to perhaps place a chair in the right place to get his banana, which is hanging overhead. But according to Colin Ronan in his book The Universe, this is the acme of problem solving in the chimpanzee. Whereas human beings, on the other hand, can think about thinking and can think about the whole question of problem solving on the whole. So human beings think on a much higher dimension. Human beings have a consciousness that permits them to have religious ideas. This, of course, is much different from the animal world. In fact, anthropologists have tried to answer whether or not what are called pre-humans might have had any form of religion. And the closest they have found is Neanderthal man being buried with flowers. But that does not give any conclusive evidence whether Neanderthal man really practiced religion and whether they had sacred rites at their burials. All we have is the evidence of flowers. But in any case, Neanderthal man is not said to be leading up to modern human beings, but now is thought to be a side branch of evolution leading away from the modern species of Homo sapiens. So in any case, we have it now that modern human beings are the only species that we know that practice religion. There is probably some reason for this, and the universal consciousness among human beings is that there is something which is bigger and greater than ourselves. This is why we find that in the world's major religions there is some sense of an ultimate being. Even in Buddhism, which denies or does not speak of the existence of God, does have this concept of a universal being with whom we must unify after having reached the stage of nirvana. So why this is so needs to be explained. It seems that for all of these reasons, it is better to say that there is a soul that survives after death, as the scripture confirms.
Consciousness is a physical phenomenon. It arises from physiological, chemical, biological, physical processes going on inside that enormously complex organ, the brain. As soon as the brain disintegrates, which it does on death, when it's no longer sustained by the input of metabolic processes, then the physical processes that we call consciousness decay as well. It's just simple wishful thinking that consciousness can survive the decay of the brain. Just like consciousness is put on a pedestal. I mean, there's nothing very special about consciousness. I mean, it's an amazing phenomenon, but it's not really very special. It is just a physical process going on inside the brain, which we don't yet fully understand. The soul is simply an extension of the idea that consciousness persists after death. So the soul, if you like, is just simple wishful thinking. I think the soul is it makes philosophers' life worthwhile. They've invented it, building upon the fears of humans. So, of course we're more complex than chimpanzees. Of course we can have worries and things like that. We've got more cortex. I mean, that's what science says. Look inside your head. You've got more cortex. That's a much more complex signal processing can go on in there. And it's not surprising that some of that signal processing leads to error. And some of that error is poetry, and some of it is religion.
We are intellectually honest and understand the limitations of the scientific method. Science can only make verifiable conclusions of observable, tangible phenomena which can be subjected to experiment. Science therefore cannot prove or disprove God. If you understand God as a creator to be independent of creation and unlimited in time and space, can both speakers please comment? Yeah.
I agree, I think, with every word of that. Surprisingly. Sorry. I agree with every word of that, surprisingly. If there isn't a God, then there's clearly nothing to study, which is one problem that science has with God. What more can one say? There might be a God. I don't believe there is one, and I think all the evidence points to there not being. But I certainly can't disprove mathematically, if you like, that there is one. All I can do is to assemble ideas and evidence around me to show that there is no need for a God. And I can assemble evidence to show why people long for there to be a God, and I can put those two together and conclude that there is in fact no God. But I can't actually prove that there isn't one.
If you recall my explanation of the what is commonly called the cosmological argument, the argument for the existence of God from the fact that we do have the cosmos, then if we go back to the Big Bang origin, then we're talking about the origin of the universe, and if there is a creator, that creator naturally is outside of the space-time continuum that we do observe. And so Dr. Atkins is right. There will be no way of disproving scientifically that such a God exists, and hence his conclusion that there might be a God is a valid one. Now he thinks that there is not a God, and I think that there is a God, and he thinks that there might be a God. But on the other hand, if indeed Dr. Atkins is right and there is no God, Dr. Atkins, I'd like to give you my full assurance that in that case I would have nothing to worry about.
Within the talks were mentioned Kazakhstan, Japan and Arabia. I have never seen any of these places. Why should I assume that they exist? I.e., why should I believe in something that I haven't sensed?
I will try to slightly enlarge on that. I think the point of science is that it's a network of interrelating mutually supportive ideas. That's the amazing thing about science, that ideas flow into the corpus of knowledge that we call science from all manner of different directions, and that where they mingle, they do not conflict. They are supportive. This is an amazing feature of science. So the fact that in order to understand the large-scale structure of the universe, we actually need to draw on material relating to fundamental particles, as it were, the other scale of being, really. But where the two ideas of the grandness of the universe and the microscopic structure of the universe mingle, they don't conflict. They turn out to be mutually supportive. So if I see something which conflicts with science as a whole, I am extremely suspicious of it. I am suspicious, for example, of anything supernatural. I don't believe that anything supernatural ever has occurred. I don't believe that any miracle has ever occurred, simply because it conflicts too much with the corpus, the whole fabric of science. But if something does fit in with this corpus of knowledge that we call science, I'm sympathetic to it, and I believe that it might well exist.
the question points to a very important point. We learn about things that we haven't observed by getting reports about the existence of such things, like countries, for example, like Kazakhstan. And so it would be a little bit rude to go through life saying, I'm not going to believe anything except what I observe myself. But now, is there a supernatural dimension? Is there a metaphysical world that we can know about apart from science? Can religion contribute to that understanding? Yes, in the similar sense that we receive information from other sources. We can receive information from the metaphysical world by reading the glorious Quran. Now the question is this Quran really that sort of information, or is it a construct of human consciousness? When we examine the Quran, we see that it could not have come from the man who first pronounced it to the world. The Quran speaks to that man, addresses him, even criticizes him. The man himself was not capable of reading or writing. He couldn't have written a book, much less a book like the Quran. The man himself was sincere. He kept on preaching the message despite persecution. He refused offers. He died penniless. He refused power and wealth, so he had no motive for lying to the people. Moreover, he couldn't have lied to the people because the information contained in the Quran reflects some past history, and we see that to be accurate, tells us about the future, and the future turns out exactly the way the Quran said that it would. The Quran describes physical phenomena which modern scientists find to be extremely amazing, and they realize that this information could not have come from the milieu or the time when the Quran was made available to the world. Moreover, the Quran challenges human beings to find errors in it, thus disproving it to be from God, and moreover to produce a book like it to show that it is humanly possible to produce such a book. And today no one can explain why no one has been able to produce a book like the Quran except to conclude that the Quran is a miracle and hence a message from God telling us that the subconscious does exist, that the world, the metaphysical world does exist, and God and the soul do exist.
There are a number of related questions here, so inshallah I'll try and put them all together. Professor Atkins mentions that humans learnt morals through the evolution of society over thousands of years, but during that time society all over the world was steeped in religion. Does he not think humans need a spiritual foundation for morals, i.e. some sort of religious belief? The second law of thermodynamics just leads to despair. Already religion has receded this century in Western culture, and accompanying that there is great disillusionment in society. What can suitably replace religion as a believable moral guide for humans? As an addition to that, how does or can science instill ethics and morality into a human being and the concept of what is right and what is wrong?
These questions touch upon a very important point, the question of morals. Science is incapable of teaching morals. It is outside of the domain of science to do this. Now, that doesn't mean that scientists are amoral, or that they do not have morals of their own, or that scientists will not try to teach their own morals to others. When Dr. Atkins comes up here, he might want to tell you that we should not encroach upon the domain and the rights of others. Now, that's a very fine principle, but that principle doesn't come from science, it comes from philosophy and from religion. So it is outside the domain of science. You see, science can discover things, but cannot tell us how to use those things. When the man Nobel invented dynamite, he invented it for good purposes, for quarrying. But the same dynamite is used for taking lives. And to Nobel's shock and dismay, this is what happened. He had predicted that war would now become impossible after the invention of the dynamite, because nobody would want to use dynamite to their own self-destruction, perhaps. But Nobel was wrong. And when he found out how wrong he was, he donated a large sum of his wealth to establish the Peace Prize, among other things. When the Italian scientist Sorbero discovered gunpowder, he wanted to keep his invention secret. He didn't want the world to find out how to use gunpowder, but to his utter dismay, we're using it. And now we have nuclear weapons. Science can give us these things, but cannot tell us how to use them. Science can tell us how to construct an atomic bomb, but it is left to religion to tell us how to use these. Now, without religion, there is no absolute way of determining what is good and bad. You might say that given the evolutionary perspective, what is good is what you have learned is beneficial for yourself. But then questions arise. What is beneficial for the individual over the community, or the community over the individual? If it is useful for me at the time, is it right to go ahead and rape, kill, and plunder? If it is beneficial to me, if I can find a way to get away with it, according to the utilitarian principle that would have to be adopted through the evolutionary thinking, is that if it is beneficial for you, there is no reason why you shouldn't do it. But religion says that no, it is absolutely wrong. It is what Kant called the categorical imperative. It is not wrong because it will be disadvantageous to you, or it is not good because it will be advantageous to you. It is either wrong because it is wrong, or it is right because it is right. And most of us think that certain things are definitely wrong, like the torturing of an innocent child just for fun. Where do we get this idea from that this is definitely wrong? It comes from a precept in religion that God already instilled in human beings this distinction between right and wrong.
Heaven protect us if we rely upon religion to tell us when to use weapons and not to use weapons. When we look at the history of the world and the wars that have been driven by religion, and indeed the wars that continue to be driven by religion, one is simply horrified at the thought that we are putting weapons into the hands of religious. My point that I actually made in my presentation was that science can teach us morality in the sense that we can understand human nature through science. We can understand the origins of our behavior. It's far better to understand the origins of our animal behavior, if you like, than to put our trust in a written authority compiled centuries ago. You can see how religion, how evolution might have generated a sense of morality. I'm not saying that this is a realistic model, but you could say, well, once upon a time there was a tribe who decided that it was right to eat their children. Now, such a tribe thought it was right, but such a tribe would not persist, quite clearly, that it would be dead and extinct within a generation or so. And so ingrained into the tribes that actually do persist and have survived to the present day is a sense that, okay, maybe we shouldn't eat our children, and on a lesser extent torture our children. So that's the way that we should look at ourselves, to see how behavior has emerged through the ability of tribes and to survive. We also have this extraordinary ability that is possessed by no other organism to reflect upon the consequences of our actions, and that is the major component of our morality. We can see that it's best not to stab our neighbours in the back because they might stab us, and so there is a kind of, if you like, a Darwinian form of behaviour. I think that's all I need to say on that.
The next question is, what science is there in the Quran?
Well, the Quran is a remarkable book in that it was revealed in the 7th century.